The time for this debate has expired. I call on Government Order of the Day number 1.
Dairy Industry Restructuring Amendment Bill number 2, committee stage continued.
I declare the House in committee for further consideration of the Dairy Industry Restructuring Amendment Bill number 2. Mr Chairman.
Mr Speaker. Members, the House in committee is in committee for further consideration of the Dairy Industry Restructuring Amendment Bill number 2. Members, when we were last considering this bill, we were debating the question that Part 1 stand part.
Mr Chair.
I call the Honourable David Bennett.
Thank you, Mr Chair, and it's good to see Minister Chris Hipkins in the chair as well, and I hope that he will be able to answer a very simple question that I put to the Minister last night, and it's not an agricultural question, it is a policy question which I think that as a suitably qualified member of the Labor Cabinet, he will be able to give us some direction upon, because it is not something that is particular to the Minister of Agriculture, but rather something that of a policy nature he would be able to determine for us. And that is, in the Dairy Restructuring Amendment Bill, the question asked is around why they took out the clause around open entry and exit. Now, for the Minister's awareness, that clause was in the original bill that the National Party had presented to the House. And basically it gave the ability of Fonterra to say no to new conversions, that they would have to provide capability in their industrial manufacturing sites to process. So effectively they have to provide the infrastructure in stainless steel to enable production of those milk solids into products, and generally that would go into milk powders, which are not value-added products, because it is spare capacity that they would not have that major investment in. Now, the Minister made it very clear that the emphasis that the government is taking in this bill is to direct the industry into a more value-added approach, and nobody has any problem with that. In fact, Fonterra and farmers are very much in that zone. The question is, why then do they take out a clause that encourages now, because there is no clause that open entry and exit provision is removed, it means that Fonterra has to provide a lot more commodity-based infrastructure, when, if they left that clause in, it would achieve their purpose of more value add for the industry. So it's a very simple policy issue that I think the Minister and the Chair would be able to give us direction on. He's a very astute Minister that understands understands a lot of the policies behind legislation like this, so it's not something that we needed the actual Minister there to determine. So I'd like to have a reply from him as to why that clause was taken out, because it seems contrary to the intention that the Labor government has made clear in its speeches in this House last night, and just doesn't make sense when it's what the industry wanted, it's what farmers wanted, it's what the general public want, is to see a more value add, and yet we're taking out the one clause that would have encouraged that value add, and now we're encouraging more of the same, in essence, of a lot of powder production. The second issue that I didn't get a chance to talk about in my first contribution in the committee stage yesterday was in relation to regulated milk. So this is the portion of milk that Fonterra has to supply to new start-up companies. And when Fonterra was formed, the intention was that, of course, there would be that supply to let those companies start, and they get basically milk at cost price. So Fonterra delivers it at cost price to these companies. No, it's how it works, Mr. Carter, and so effectively these companies get a start with having not to do their own collection at that point. Now, what was looked at from Fonterra's point of view, they see that as becoming difficult to maintain because they're giving a very big start to those other companies. And so the submission and what was agreed upon was to reduce that regulated large-scale provision of milk. Now, that makes a lot of sense when you consider the argument that New Zealand First has made consistently in the public around the internationalisation of the dairy processing industry. And New Zealand First has been very careful on a number of occasions to make public statements saying that they don't believe New Zealand regulated milk should go to international processors. And if we look at our market and the production of milk, and even in the South Island there's a very high proportion that has an international component. For example, Synlait, Bright Dairy, a Chinese company, has 39%. Open Country has a shareholding that's overseas based. If you look at some of the other companies like Yashili and Oceania, Mr Chair.
The Honourable David Bennett. Mr
Chair, those companies also have a very much an overseas presence in what and how they are owned. So they effectively are getting a subsidised milk from New Zealand farmers in a New Zealand cooperative for international companies. And rightly, as you would expect, New Zealand First found that very egregious, and they have taken upon themselves to say in many public statements how bad that is. And I just want to quote the Right Honourable Winston Peters in the Waikato Times on the 6th of March 2017. And I am brave, and he said here that New Zealand First will not be so craven. While it is positive Fonterra will finally get controlling its burgeoning milk pool in 2018-19 with discretion overtaking milk from new dairy conversions, we would ensure that regulated milk only goes to New Zealand-owned processors. So this is what New Zealand First has said in their policy and what they have said pre-election. We will ensure that regulated milk only goes to New Zealand-owned processors. Now, the regulated milk provisions in the bill that was put forward by the previous minister have been removed. And one cannot reconcile the fact that the Labour New Zealand First coalition has removed the clauses that would limit regulated milk. And in fact, what New Zealand First is actually doing by voting for this bill in the form it is now is increasing the amount of milk that now goes to international companies and internationally owned companies, because they're not limiting that amount of regulated milk. And that is very much contrary to the perception of New Zealand First. It's contrary to the approach that New Zealand First has always taken. And another comment from the Right Honourable Winston Peters on the 16th of June 2016, where he said, if you look at this Act, that it only benefits the foreign processors. So instead of having the sunset clauses that would have applied in the legislation, that's the 80% threshold, and reducing it to 75% and keeping the legislation going, the Right Honourable Winston Peters, his comment was that this only benefits foreign produced processors. So I asked the New Zealand First Party to actually explain through the Minister, because the Minister will be acting on behalf of both coalition partners, as to why, before this bill was actually introduced to this House yesterday, why they were so strident in their opposition to foreign processors, and yet the very bill they bring in means that foreign processors have more access to milk. Why did they take away the provision that would have limited foreign processors' access to milk and replace it with nothing but encourage and mean that foreign processors have that access? It just does not make sense from a New Zealand First point of view that they would do that. So there are two things that I would like the Minister to explain. The first is a policy rationale. Why this government has taken out the open entry and exit provisions that would have meant that Fonterra would have been able to say no to new conversions and therefore would have been able to invest more money in value add rather than just have to have more stainless steel there, why that was taken out. Secondly, why the other provision on regulated milk was taken out, which only has the effect of encouraging and increasing the milk supply at a regulated price to foreign companies. And those two things can still be left in this legislation and still enable the Labor Party to do their wider review. That doesn't preclude them doing that. I just can't understand why they've taken them out from a policy point of view, because it doesn't match with the intention that the Labor Party said yesterday of wanting to have more value add, and it doesn't match with the intention that New Zealand First Party said of reducing the regulated milk that would go to international companies. So I'd really appreciate if the Minister could answer those two questions. Thank you.
Chairman.